The water came without warning, the way death always had in Myrtle Quinn's life, and by the time she realized the creek behind her property had swallowed its own banks, the mud was already licking at her porch steps. It was the spring of 1882, and the Oklahoma Territory was drowning under 3 weeks of relentless rain that had turned the red clay earth into something resembling a river bottom. The town of Caldera Flats, if you could call a scattering of timber buildings and sun-bleached signs a town, sat in a shallow valley between two ridges that funneled every drop of skywater directly toward its center. The ranchers to the north had been talking about it for days, warning anyone who would listen that the upper creek was running full and fast and mean. But warnings had a way of dissolving before they reached the ears of a woman living alone, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, with a failing cattle operation and enough grief in her chest to fill a well. Myrtle was 31 years old. She had the kind of face that photographs failed to capture, honestly strong through the jaw, quiet in the eyes, with a mouth that seemed always on the verge of saying something important and deciding against it. Her hair was the color of dark copper, and she wore it pinned back with ruthless practicality. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Cal Quinn, had died of a fever that had moved through him like a brush fire in July of 1880, burning fast and without mercy, leaving her with 200 acres, 47 head of cattle, a mortgage that was 2 payments behind, and a silence in the house so thick she sometimes pressed her hand to the wall just to feel something solid. She was standing at her kitchen window, watching the rain sheet sideways across the yard, when she first heard the sound beneath the water, not rain, not wind, but a voice. Low, hoarse, barely distinguishable from the rushing of the creek that had now reached the bottom of the porch steps. She leaned closer to the glass and squinted through the gray curtain of the storm. There was a man clinging to the fence post at the edge of her property. The fence she had repaired herself 3 times that spring. He was chest-deep in water that was moving with terrifying purpose, his hat long gone, his dark hair plastered flat against his skull. He was shouting something she could not hear through the glass and the rain, but his meaning was perfectly clear. He was losing his grip. Myrtle Quinn did not hesitate, which surprised her later when she thought about it, because hesitation had become her most reliable companion since Cal died. She pulled on her oilskin coat and her tall rubber boots, and she pushed through the back door into the assault of the storm. The cold hit her like a slap. The water on the porch was already 2 inches deep and moving, tugging at her boots with a sly and patient insistence. She grabbed the length of rope she kept coiled on the porch post habit from years of working cattle, and she waded down the steps, gasping at the cold as the water climbed to her knees. "Hold on," she shouted. The wind threw her words sideways, but the man on the fence post turned his face toward her, and she could see from 20 yards away the raw relief in his expression. She tied one end of the rope to the porch railing, knotted it 3 times the way Cal had taught her, tested it with her full weight, and then she waded toward the fence post with the other end coiled over her shoulder. The water was thigh-deep by the time she reached him, and the current was pulling at her with a seriousness that made her jaw clench. She threw the rope. He caught it on the first pass. She braced herself as he let go of the post, and the current took him briefly, swinging him like a pendulum on the end of the line, and then she was pulling with everything she had, her boots sliding in the mud beneath the water, her shoulders screaming, until he found his feet and they were both staggering back toward the house together. They collapsed onto the porch in a heap of soaked wool and mud and gasping breath. Myrtle sat up first. She pushed her wet hair out of her eyes and looked at the stranger she had just dragged out of the flood. He was perhaps 33 or 34, lean and long in the way of a man who spent his life outdoors, with a jaw that was dark with several days of beard and a pair of gray eyes that were currently fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than gratitude. "You could have been killed," he said. His voice was low and rough-edged, like wood that had been sanded but not finished. "So could you," Myrtle said, and got to her feet. She offered him her hand. He took it, and she noticed his grip was strong even now, even after whatever the flood had done to him, and he did not use her hand as a crutch so much as accept it as a gesture, which she appreciated without knowing why. "Owen Ramsey," he said once he was standing. "Myrtle Quinn," she said, "you had better come inside." She led him through the back door into her kitchen, where the wood stove was burning and the warmth was so immediate after the cold outside that he made an involuntary sound, something between a sigh and a groan, that he seemed immediately embarrassed by. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair nearest the stove. She was already moving, pulling towels from the shelf above the sink, lifting the kettle onto the stove with a practiced efficiency that came from years of doing everything herself. He sat. He looked around the kitchen with the careful eyes of a man who understood he was in someone else's territory and was taking stock without being rude about it. The kitchen was sparse but not bare. There were herbs drying from the ceiling beam. There was a row of preserving jars on the shelf, all labeled in a tight, precise hand. There was a coat hook near the door where a man's jacket still hung heavy canvas, salt-stained at the collar, and Myrtle saw his eyes land on it and move away without comment. She handed him a towel. "Your horse?" she asked. Something flickered in his expression. "Lost him 2 miles back. The creek took him before I could get clear." He paused. "Good horse." The grief in those 2 words was simple and unguarded, and it made her chest do something unexpected. She had been through enough loss herself to recognize the specific quality of it when someone else carried it. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in a way that encompassed more than just the horse. He nodded. He pressed the towel against his face and held it there for a moment, and when he lowered it, his expression had rearranged itself into something more composed. She poured hot water into a tin cup and added the remains of the morning's coffee grounds through the strainer and handed it to him. It was not good coffee. He drank it like it was. "Where were you headed?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Outside, the rain had intensified, which she had not thought possible. The sound of it on the roof was like a sustained drum roll. "Caldera Flats," he said. "I have a meeting with the land office there, supposed to close on a parcel north of town." "You are not going to Caldera Flats tonight," Myrtle said, and gestured toward the window, where the last gray light of the afternoon had given way to a darkness that was absolute. "The road will be underwater all the way to the ridge." He turned and looked at the window, and the reality of his situation seemed to settle over him properly for the first time. "No," he said, "I suppose not." The silence that followed was not entirely comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people in close proximity who do not yet know the shape of each other. "I have a spare room," Myrtle said, not looking at him. She said it in the same tone she might announce that she had an extra jar of peaches. Practical, unarguable. "You can sleep there until the water drops." "Mrs. Quinn," he started. "I'm not asking you to feel indebted," she said, and now she did look at him directly and level. "I am telling you the practical truth. You cannot go anywhere tonight. The spare room has a bed and a blanket. You are welcome to it, or you are welcome to the porch, but I would not recommend the porch given the current conditions." He looked at her for a long moment. Those gray eyes were very still, very attentive, in a way she was not accustomed to. Most men she had known, including Cal in his better moments, looked past her while she talked, as though the important information might arrive from somewhere behind her head. Owen Ramsey looked at her. "Thank you," he said simply. She got up and showed him the spare room, which was small and plain and smelled faintly of cedar from the chest in the corner. She put a fresh candle on the nightstand and showed him where the extra blankets were stacked. "There is a change of clothes in the chest," she said, and then stopped, because the clothes in the chest were Cal's, and she had not opened it in 14 months, and the words stuck in her throat like a splinter. Owen Ramsey noticed. He said nothing about it. He simply said, "Thank you. I will be careful with them," which was exactly the right thing to say. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a long time, listening to the rain and the rush of the water outside and the quiet sounds from the spare room, the creak of the floorboard, the soft close of the chest, and she told herself that the warmth in her chest was only the stove and the relief of having acted decisively in a crisis, and she almost believed it. She made supper: beans and salt pork and cornbread, nothing more than what she had been making for herself for 14 months. But she set 2 places at the table, which she had not done since Cal died, and the small addition of the second plate and the second fork changed the feeling of the kitchen in a way she could not have anticipated. Owen Ramsey came back to the kitchen in Cal's work shirt and trousers, which fit him reasonably well except in the shoulders, where they pulled slightly because Owen was built with more breadth there than Cal had been. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if asking permission to enter a room he had already been in. "Sit," she said again, and this time there was something almost warm in it. They ate. The rain continued its assault on the roof. At some point a branch came down in the yard with a crash that made Myrtle set down her fork and listen, but nothing followed it, and she picked the fork up again. "How long have you been here?" Owen asked. "On this land, I mean." 7 years, she said. "Cal and I came out from Missouri in '75, homesteaded this parcel, 200 acres." She paused. "He died 2 winters ago." "I am sorry," he said, with the same plain sincerity she had offered him earlier about the horse. "Fever," she said. "It went through fast, too fast." She ate a spoonful of beans. "What brings you to this part of the territory? You are not from here." "Missouri, actually," he said, and something shifted in her expression that might have been surprise. "St. Joseph originally, but I have been in Kansas for the past 4 years, working cattle drives, saving what I could." He looked down at his plate. "I decided it was time to stop moving." She understood that, the desire to stop moving, the desire to sink roots into some particular piece of earth and say, "Here, this is mine. This is where I belong." She understood it in her bones. "The parcel you are buying," she said, "is at Harding's old place, north of the ridge." He nodded. "You know it." "I know all the land around here," she said simply. It was not a boast, it was a fact. "Harding's place has good soil. The well is deep. There was a problem with the northeast corner flooding every spring. The natural drainage runs wrong there, but it can be managed." He looked at her with an interest that was thoughtful and specific. "You know about that?" "I know this land," she said again. They talked through supper and into the first hour after it, which was something neither of them had planned. Owen Ramsey, it turned out, was not a man of many words as a rule, but when he spoke, what he said was considered and honest. He told her about the cattle drives, the summer of '79, when they had pushed a herd up through a grass fire that closed behind them like a gate, the winter of '80, when 3 men had quit 200 miles from anywhere, and the remaining 4 had brought the herd in on frost-bitten feet. He told her about the foreman he had learned everything from, an old man named Dooley who had died of a bad heart outside Abilene the previous fall, and the way he said it made it clear that Dooley had been something close to family. Myrtle told him about the cattle she kept, the 47 head, the constant calculus of keeping them fed through dry summers on land that tested her every year. She told him about the mortgage and the bank man who came every quarter with his leather satchel, and his careful expression that was not quite sympathy. She did not tell him how close she had come, in the dark January just past, to deciding she could not hold on. But something in the way he listened made her think he might have understood it without being told. At 9 o'clock she showed him where the candles and matches were kept, and she said good night and went to her room, which was on the other side of the house from the spare room, and she lay in the dark listening to the rain and the water and the sound of another person breathing somewhere in her house, which she had not heard in 14 months, and she thought, what a strange thing, what a terrifyingly ordinary thing. She slept better than she had in months. The water had not dropped by morning. If anything, it had risen. The porch was submerged to the floorboards, and the lower pasture had disappeared entirely beneath a flat gray sheet of water that stretched to the tree line. The cattle had moved up to the higher ground on the north end of the property, which was the one mercy, because higher ground was one of the things Myrtle had insisted on when Cal had first surveyed the property. She had walked every inch of it before they signed the paper. She was already at the stove when Owen Ramsey came into the kitchen at first light, his hair damp. He had apparently found the wash basin in the spare room, and the borrowed shirt rolled to his elbows. "It is worse," he said, looking out the window. "It will peak today," she said, with a certainty that came from 7 years of reading this land's particular moods. "It always peaks on the second day and then it drops." "You sound sure of that." "I have been here 7 years," she said. She handed him a cup of coffee, real coffee this morning that she had measured carefully from the tin. "Have you eaten?" "I was not expecting to be fed," he said carefully. "No one said anything about expecting," she said. "I am asking if you have eaten." "No, ma'am." "Then sit down." She made eggs from the hens that were currently very unhappy in the upper coop, and more cornbread, and she sliced cold salt pork from the piece in the larder. She moved around the kitchen with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, and she was aware with a low-level awareness she did not examine too closely that Owen Ramsey's eyes followed her as she moved, not in the way of a man with idle or predatory intentions, but in the way of a man watching something that interests him, watching the way a person works. "What can I do?" he asked. She glanced at him. "What?" "I am trapped here same as you," he said. "I should be useful." She thought about it. There was a list, as always, of things that needed doing. There was always a list. "The window frame in the spare room has been letting water in when it rains hard," she said. "The putty is gone around the lower left corner. There is putty and a knife in the toolbox on the porch. The porch is still accessible from the front. The water is not that high on that side." He nodded. He went and did it without another word. She heard him working while she cleaned the kitchen, the small systematic sounds of a person who knew how to work. When he came back inside an hour later, he said, "Also, there is a shingle off on the north corner of the roof. I can get to it from the porch rail if you have a spare shingle and nails." She stared at him. "How did you see a missing shingle from the porch?" "I looked up," he said. She almost laughed. The impulse was so surprising she had to press her lips together. "There are spare shingles in the lean-to," she said. "The lean-to is currently flooded, so you will have to wade." "All right," he said, and pulled on the oilskin coat she had loaned him from the hook by the door, not Cal's coat, her spare one, and went back out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him wade through the water in the yard to the lean-to, emerge with a shingle tucked under one arm and a handful of nails, and climb the porch rail with the agility of a man who had been doing physical work his whole life. She watched him fix the shingle with steady, methodical strokes of the hammer, and then check the surrounding shingles and fix one more she had not noticed was loose, and then climb back down and wade back to the house. He came in dripping and set the hammer on the table. "Both corners are good now," he said. "Thank you," she said. What else? The day passed in that way. It was, she would think afterward, one of the most peculiar days of her life and one of the most unexpectedly good. The flood trapped them both, but gave them a kind of enforced proximity that was oddly comfortable, like being held at rest by something external. Owen moved through her house with a careful respect for its geometry, always asking before he opened a cabinet or moved a tool. He did not try to take over or redirect her methods. He simply worked beside her, or in a different room from her, and the sounds of the two of them occupied the house like a conversation that did not require words. At noon she made soup from dried beans and the last of the winter's stored vegetables, and they sat at the table and ate, and this time the conversation came more easily. He told her about Missouri. She told him about growing up in Ohio before her father moved the family west. He told her about a cattle drive joke that made absolutely no sense unless you had spent months on horseback with the same 6 men. And when she asked him to explain it, he tried and made it worse, and the second explanation was somehow funnier than the joke had been. And she did laugh this time. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it surprised both of them. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes and did not say anything, but something in his expression shifted very slightly, like a landscape when the light changes. In the afternoon, the rain eased to a steady drizzle and then to a mist, and the water on the porch stopped rising. Myrtle stood at the back window watching it and said, more to herself than to him, "There it is peeking." He came and stood beside her at the window. He was a head taller than she was, and she was not a short woman. She was aware of the warmth that came off him even in the cool of the house, and she kept her eyes on the water. "By tomorrow morning?" he asked. "By tomorrow afternoon," she said. "The creek drops faster than it rises. The road should be passable by day after tomorrow." The words sat between them, day after tomorrow. After which he would go to Caldera Flats and close on his parcel and begin his new life on the other side of the ridge. And she would go back to the business of being alone in this house that held the silence of a man who was gone. She turned away from the window first. That evening she roasted the last hen she had been saving, because it seemed a kind of occasion, though she could not have said what kind. She made gravy and biscuits and opened a jar of the corn she had put up in August, and when she set the table and Owen Ramsey came in from where he had been checking on the cattle on the North Rise, wading through the receding flood to make sure they were sound, without being asked, because he had simply looked out the window and seen that it needed doing, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. "You did not need to do all that," he said. "I know it," she said, and set the gravy on the table with a firmness that closed the subject. They sat down. The oil lamp was lit. The rain had stopped entirely, and the silence outside was the particular silence that comes after a sustained thing ends, the absence ringing like a bell. "Tell me about the land you are buying," she said. He told her. His voice changed when he talked about it, the same way her voice changed when she talked about her own 200 acres. He had been specific in his plans, a small herd to start, no more than 30 head, building slowly. A kitchen garden, a root cellar. He had drawings, he said, that he had made in a notebook over the course of 4 years on the cattle drives. Plans for the house he would build, the barn, the placement of the fences. "You drew plans," she said, watching him. "I had 4 years to think about it," he said. "It was either draw plans or go crazy." "Show me," she said before she could think better of it. He looked at her. "They are in my saddlebag," he said slowly, "which is presumably on the bottom of the creek somewhere." "Oh," she said, "I am sorry." "The plans are in my head," he said. "The notebook was just paper." She thought about that, the confidence of it. The plans were in his head. 4 years of thinking stored somewhere behind those gray eyes, as solid and real as anything written down. "The northeast flooding problem," she said. "If you are planning to put your kitchen garden in the lower quarter, you will need to think about drainage." He leaned forward. "Tell me." So she did. She drew on the table with her finger as she talked, sketching the invisible landscape of the land adjacent to hers, the way the water ran, the natural channels, the places where a man could redirect things with a few hours of digging and some strategic placement of stones. She had been thinking about Harding's old place for years, not because she had wanted it, but because she was the kind of person who thought about land. He watched her finger trace patterns on the wood of the table, and then he began to ask questions, intelligent, specific questions that told her he had been studying this kind of thing on his own, that he knew enough to know what he did not know, which was the most useful kind of knowledge. They sat at that table for 2 hours after supper, talking about land and water and seasons and cattle, and at some point the conversation wandered away from practicalities into something less defined, and she talked about Cal without quite meaning to, about the year they homesteaded, the first winter when the only thing between them and disaster was the fact that Cal had guessed right about the snow depth and built the barn walls high enough. And Owen listened in the way he always listened, with his full attention without filling the silence with unnecessary words. "He sounds like he was a good man," Owen said. "He was," she said. "He was not a perfect man. Nobody is, but he was good." She looked at the lamp. "I miss him differently now than I did at first. At first I missed the whole thing, the entire presence of him. Now I miss specific things, the way he could fix any piece of equipment with whatever happened to be available, the way he sang off-key in the morning and did not know he was doing it." Owen was quiet for a moment. "That sounds right," he said, "that it changes." "Have you lost someone?" she asked. "My mother," he said, "when I was 19. My father had already been gone 6 years before that, so it was just me after." He said it without self-pity, just the plain facts. "I understand the specific kind of quiet that a house has after." She looked at him. He was looking at the lamp, and in the warm light of it he looked older somehow, and younger too, the way people sometimes do when they are telling the truth. "It is a particular kind of quiet," she agreed. She went to bed later than she should have, and lay awake longer than was comfortable, and the thoughts she was trying not to have kept arranging themselves in the space behind her eyes with a persistence she could not quite argue down. In the morning the water had dropped 8 inches on the porch and the lower pasture was beginning to emerge, and Myrtle Quinn stood looking at the receding flood and felt, for the first time, something that was not entirely relief. Owen was already up and had made coffee, which she discovered when she came into the kitchen. He had found the grounds and the pot and the proper process without instruction, and the coffee was good, better than hers, with a richness she did not expect from a man who had probably been making cowboy coffee over an open fire for 4 years. "You figured out the stove," she said. "She is particular," he agreed, patting the side of the stove in a way that was so unexpectedly affectionate she had to look away. They drank coffee together in the morning quiet and watched the water retreat across the yard, inch by inch, leaving behind the red clay mud that was the land's constant truth. Myrtle could see her fence posts emerging, the lower corral gate, the edge of the woodpile that had been half submerged. "I should check the cattle today," she said. "I will come," he said. "2 people are faster than 1 for a count." It was a practical offer and she accepted it practically, but there was something about walking through the wet, shining, post-flood world with this man beside her that she did not want to examine directly. The sky had broken open into a blue that only existed after sustained rain, the particular blue of washed glass, and the smell of the wet earth was intoxicating in the way of things that have been released. The cattle were all present, which was a mercy. A few of them had mud to their knees, and one heifer had a small cut on her shoulder that Myrtle cleaned and dressed with the kit she had brought, and Owen held the heifer still while she worked with a calmness that kept the animal settled. "You are good with them," she said, watching his hands on the heifer's neck. "Been around cattle my whole working life," he said. "You learn to be quiet." They walked the full perimeter of the property, checking fence lines where the water had undermined posts, noting where repairs would need to happen. It took the better part of the morning. By the time they came back to the house, the lower pasture was mostly clear of water, just standing puddles in the hollows, and Myrtle had a list in her head of everything that needed to be done in the next 2 weeks. She said as much at lunch, cataloging the work, and without comment Owen said, "The fence posts on the south line need to be reset before they fall. You have the posts." "In the lean-to," she said. "I can start this afternoon," he said. "The ground will be soft enough to make it easy work." She looked at him across the table. "You do not need to do that," she said carefully. "I know it," he said, using her words from the night before, and there was something in his expression that was almost a smile, not quite, but in the neighborhood of one. "You will want to get to Caldera Flats," she said. "Your land office appointment." "It can wait another day," he said. "The land will still be there." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. The afternoon was golden. That was the only word for it. The sun had come out with the full force of itself after 3 weeks of rain, and the world was steaming gently, and the colors were saturated and rich. And Myrtle worked alongside Owen Ramsey, setting fence posts in soft earth that accepted them easily. And she felt a lightness in her chest that she recognized, distantly, as happiness. Not the complex grief-shadowed happiness she had been constructing carefully for the past 14 months, one solid block at a time, but something more immediate and less constructed, something that arrived on its own without being planned. They talked while they worked. She learned that he had a preference for tea over coffee in the evenings, that he had read more books than she would have expected, that he had a younger sister back in Missouri, who had married a school teacher, and was apparently doing very well with 3 children and a solid house on a good street. He learned that she had been painting the kitchen ceiling herself last fall and had fallen off the chair and bruised 3 ribs and finished the job anyway. He learned that she had taught herself to do basic veterinary work on her cattle out of pure necessity, and a medical reference book she had sent for from a publisher in Chicago. She learned that he had once navigated a cattle drive through 200 miles of contested land in Kansas during a period when the disputes over land rights had turned violent, and that he had managed it without a single incident through a combination of patience and an absolute refusal to escalate any situation. "That is a skill," she said, hammering a post. "Some men think it makes you a coward," he said. "Some men think wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment then. "I think the same." In the evening they sat on the front porch, which was dry now, and watched the sun go down over the ridge in colors that seemed designed to make a person feel something significant. The air smelled of wet earth and new green and something else, something warm and faintly floral from the wild plum thickets that had started blooming along the creek. Myrtle had brought out 2 cups of tea. She had found the tin of tea at the back of the shelf. She had bought it once on a whim and never opened it, and she handed one to Owen and sat down in the other chair. The silence between them was completely comfortable now. It had rearranged itself into something easy and natural, the silence of people who have established, through accumulated hours of shared space, that they do not require performance from each other. "The evening is nice," he said, eventually. "It always is after a flood," she said. "Everything gets quiet." He nodded. He held his cup in both hands and looked out at the ridge. "Mrs. Quinn," he said. "Myrtle," she said. She was not sure when she had decided that, but it was true. He turned to look at her, and the last light of the sun was on his face, and she held herself very still. "Myrtle," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was something she immediately filed away in the part of her mind that kept the things she would think about later when she was alone. "When I close on that parcel," he said, "Harding's place." "Yes," she said, "I would be your neighbor." "You would," she said. "That seems—" He stopped. Started again. "That seems like a good thing to me." She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at things she needed to understand clearly. "Does it?" she said. "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause, "I am not a man who is good at saying things in the way they ought to be said." "I am not a woman who needs them said in a particular way," she replied. He nodded slowly. "I have been here 2 days," he said. "I know that is a short time." "It is," she agreed. "But I also know that 2 days in some circumstances tells you more than 2 years in others," he said. "And I would like, if it would be agreeable to you, to call on you, properly, when I am settled." She looked at her tea. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the last sliver of sun as it dropped below the line of it. "It would be agreeable to me," she said. When she looked back at him, he was watching her with those gray eyes that had the quality of still water, and something in his face had relaxed in the way of a person who has been holding a breath they did not know they were holding. "Good," he said, "just that. Good." And it was enough. The next morning the road was passable, just barely, the mud thick and treacherous but navigable. Owen Ramsey changed back into his own clothes, which had dried by the fire. She had washed them the morning before, silently, efficiently, hanging them on the line in the brief interval of sun. And he stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which was the only sign he gave of any uncertainty. Myrtle had packed him food for the road. She was aware of the precision with which she had done it, the cornbread wrapped in cloth, the hard-boiled eggs, the piece of salt pork, aware that she was doing it with a care that exceeded pure practicality. "You will need to borrow a horse," she said. "Take the bay. His name is Garrison. He knows the road to town. Bring him back when you can." Owen looked at her. "You are lending me your horse." "I have 2, she said, "and you have no way to get to town otherwise. Bring him back when the road is solid." He was quiet for a moment. "I will bring him back," he said, "and when you do, you will have supper here," she said, firmly and without embarrassment. "That is not a question." The smallest smile she had yet seen from him crossed his face and stayed for a moment before it went away. "That is not a question," he agreed. She walked him to the barn and helped him saddle Garrison, and she watched him ride out through the mud with the bearing of a man who belonged on horseback, easy and balanced. And Garrison responded to him well, which meant something to her because Garrison was particular. She stood and watched until the road curved and he was out of sight, and then she went back to her house and stood in the kitchen and breathed. The house had the particular quality of silence it had had before he came, but it was not the same silence. It was the same space containing a different absence, and the difference was that this absence had a shape and a direction. It was pointed toward something rather than away from everything, which was a different kind of feeling entirely. She got to work. The repairs after the flood kept her occupied for 10 days, which was a mercy, because 10 days of hard physical labor did not leave a great deal of space for the kind of thinking that spirals. She reset the fence posts Owen had not gotten to, repaired the section of the coop roof that had been damaged, cleared the debris from the pasture, and treated the cattle for the various minor ailments that followed wet periods. She was halfway through repairing the south gate when she heard a horse on the road and looked up. Owen Ramsey rode Garrison up to her fence line and swung down with the ease she had already committed to memory. He was wearing his own hat now, a good quality brown felt hat that suited him, and his own vest over his shirt, and he led Garrison to the gate post and tied him with the practiced economy of movement she had come to associate with him. "The gate needs another coat of paint," he said, looking at the section she was working on. "Hello to you too," she said. "Hello," he said, and this time the smile was more present, not hidden. "The gate needs paint." "I know the gate needs paint," she said. "I am currently fixing the hinge." "I can paint the gate," he said, "if you have paint." She looked at him. He was looking at the gate with the expression of a man assessing a practical problem, but there was something underneath it that was not practical at all, something she was getting better at reading. "Did you close on the parcel?" she asked. "Closed on it this morning," he said. "It is mine." He said the last two words with a quiet satisfaction that she felt in her own chest because she knew exactly what it was to say that about a piece of land. "I filed the papers and I have the deed. I am going out there tomorrow to have a proper look at it." "Good," she said. "Come in and I will put the kettle on, then you can paint the gate." He came in. She put the kettle on. He painted the gate while she worked on the hinge, and they talked through the open window. She could hear him from inside the house, and the naturalness of it was something she did not trust herself to examine directly because it was too close to something she had been afraid to want. Supper was better than the first 2 nights, because she had been to the supply store in town the week before and had proper provisions. She had been thinking about what he might like without entirely admitting she was doing so, and there was a proper roast with potatoes and carrots, and a dried apple pie that she had been intending to make for herself, but had made a little larger than strictly necessary. "This is," he started, when she set it on the table. "Supper," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He ate with the unperformative appreciation of a man who had spent years eating food that was adequate at best and knew the difference when he encountered something better. He said so plainly, and she accepted it without deflecting, because she had worked on that pie and she was not going to pretend she had not. After supper they sat on the front porch again, and the evening was soft and smelled of spring coming properly, the wild plums still blooming along the creek, and the sky was the clear deep blue of late evening before the full dark. "I went through the house on the parcel today," he said. "Harding left some furniture, a table, some chairs, a bed frame." "That saves you some expense," she said. "The stove needs replacing," he said. "The roof is sound, the well is good the way you said." He paused. "There is a small room off the main one that has a south-facing window, good light." "Could be a library," she said, thinking about the books he had mentioned. "Or a workroom." He looked at her sideways. "I was thinking it could be a sewing room," he said carefully. "Or whatever someone might want to use it for." The implication settled over the porch like the last light. She did not respond to it immediately. She looked at the ridge and thought about what it would mean to say the thing that was true, and then she decided that she had been alone long enough to stop treating honesty as a luxury. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not a woman who moves quickly," she said. "I need you to know that. I am not cautious because of Cal exactly. I was this way before. I think carefully before I do things." "I know that," he said. "I would not want you to be any different. I am also not a woman who is interested in," she searched for the word, "performances. I do not need courting that is theatrical. I need someone who is honest and present and means what they say." "I understand that too," he said. "Then I will tell you honestly," she said, "that you are welcome here. Whenever you want to be." She paused. "That is probably more than is entirely proper to say at this stage." "I am not particularly concerned with what is proper," he said. "Only what is true." "Then that is the truth of it," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands and then at the ridge and then at her, and in the failing light his expression was the most open she had seen it. "The truth on my side," he said, "is that I drove out of your yard 9 days ago thinking about you, and I have been thinking about you since, and I came back with your horse and not a little bit of an ulterior motive." She felt warmth move through her chest. "I suspected as much," she said. "Did you mind it?" he asked. "No," she said. "I did not mind it at all." Over the weeks that followed, Owen Ramsey became a feature of her evenings and a frequent presence on her land. He was working hard on his own parcel, building his herd from the small nucleus of 6 cattle he had purchased in Caldera Flats, repairing the barn, replacing the broken stove with a new one he had freighted in from the supply depot. But he found his way to her gate most evenings and often stayed for supper and sometimes afterward to sit on the porch and talk. And on Saturday afternoons he came early and helped with whatever the week had produced in the way of problems. He was rebuilding the woodpile after the flood damage when she brought him water one afternoon, and he straightened and drank it and wiped his mouth and said, "I have been thinking about asking you to come and see the parcel. Tell me what you think of the drainage situation on the northeast corner." "I have been thinking you would eventually ask," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Sunday." "Sunday," she agreed. She rode out to his land on Sunday morning, and she walked every inch of it with him, the way she had walked her own land 7 years ago when she and Cal had first stood on it and begun to imagine. Owen walked beside her and watched her face as she assessed things, and she gave him her honest opinion of everything. She saw the good and the problematic, because he deserved honesty and because he asked for it. The northeast corner was exactly what she had predicted. "You need to cut a channel here," she said, tracing the line with her boot. "And here. Stoneline it, do not leave it open earth or it will collapse again. The water wants to go that direction anyway, you are just giving it a better road." He crouched and looked at the ground where she had indicated. He had a piece of fence wire in his hand that he had been using to probe the soil depth, and he traced the line she had described. "That is good," he said. "That is exactly right." "I know it," she said, smiling. He looked up at her from his crouch, squinting against the sun, and his expression had that quality it sometimes had of being several things at once, amused and thoughtful and warm simultaneously. "What would I do without your expertise?" he said. "You would manage," she said. "You are not a man who does not manage." "I would manage worse," he said, and stood up. They were standing quite close, because the examination of the drainage line had brought them together, and neither of them stepped back. She looked up at him, that slight upward angle that she was getting accustomed to, and thought about all the accumulated hours between the night she had dragged him out of the flood and this moment in the spring sunshine, and how much distance and how little distance it represented. "Myrtle," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hand against her face, his palm against her jaw, very gently, as though she were something he was afraid of startling, and she did not startle. She turned her face slightly into his hand, involuntarily in the way of someone leaning toward warmth without deciding to, and she heard the breath go through him. "I would like very much to kiss you," he said, "if that is all right." "It is all right," she said. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, deliberate and honest and without rush. And she kissed him back with a fierceness that surprised her and apparently him as well. because she felt his hand tighten against her jaw and his other hand came up to her shoulder, and they stood in the northeast corner of his flooding problem, and kissed each other in the spring sunshine until the horses got bored and wandered toward the grass, and they had to stop and go retrieve them. Walking back to the horses, she could feel herself smiling in the unstoppable way she had not smiled in a very long time, the way that happens in the face before the person can do anything about it, and she pressed her lips together trying to contain it and failed. And when she looked at him, he was doing exactly the same thing. The summer of 1882 was hot and dry, which in the Oklahoma Territory meant it was a season of constant work and constant vigilance. Myrtle's cattle needed supplemental water when the creek dropped to a trickle in August, and Owen helped her engineer a series of troughs fed from the deep well on his side of the property line. His well was deeper than hers and held through the dry season, a system that required digging and pipe fitting, and a great deal of problem-solving over several days in the brutal heat. They worked side by side in it and argued amiably about the best placement of the primary trough, and she was right, and he acknowledged it readily, which was something she had found she appreciated about him more and more as the summer went on. He was not interested in being right. He was interested in things being right, which was a distinction she had learned to find very rare in men. The town of Caldera Flats had opinions about the widow Quinn and the newcomer Ramsey, because the town of Caldera Flats had opinions about everything and everyone, which was the nature of small communities in the territory. Myrtle knew this and did not particularly care about it, but she was aware of the attention and took care to conduct herself with the straightforward dignity she always had. The women at the church social asked questions with varying degrees of subtlety, and she answered the subtle ones and ignored the rest. Preacher Aldous said nothing directly, but had a look he deployed in her direction on Sundays that she chose to interpret as approval. More important to her than the town's opinion was the opinion of her closest neighbor, a woman named Clara Hatch who had been in the territory as long as Myrtle had, and who had sent food and practical assistance when Cal died, and who Myrtle trusted in the way you trust someone who has shown up for you in a crisis without being asked. Clara came to call in July, ostensibly to return a canning pot she had borrowed. She came when Owen happened to be there, which Myrtle suspected was not an accident, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and assessed Owen Ramsey with the frank thoroughness of a woman who had been evaluating people her whole life. Owen, to his credit, did not perform under Clara's assessment. He answered her questions directly and asked her some in return, and helped himself to a second cup of coffee and spoke about his plans for his land with the same specific clarity he always had. Clara watched all of this and said very little. After Owen had gone, Clara sat for another hour with Myrtle and eventually said, "He is a good man." "I know it," Myrtle said. "Cal was a good man too," Clara said. "I know that too," Myrtle said. "They are different kinds of good," Clara nodded. "That is usually how it works," she said. "You all right with it?" "I am," Myrtle said. And she was. She had done the quiet, private work of understanding that loving Owen was not a subtraction from what she had felt for Cal but an addition to the account of her life, and that Cal, who had been a good man, would have wanted the account to grow rather than close. In September, Owen asked her to marry him. He did not do it theatrically. He did not get down on one knee in a public place or present a ring from a jeweler's box. He did it the way he did everything, directly and honestly. They were sitting at her kitchen table after supper in the oil lamp light, with the particular ease that 8 months of accumulated evenings produces between two people, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say, nothing changes between us." She put down her fork. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I am not asking to be proper or because people are talking. I am asking because I want to spend my mornings and my evenings and the rest of it with you, and because I think I do better work and better thinking when you are somewhere in my vicinity, and because I would like for us to stop dividing our time between two houses." She looked at him across the table. "You are proposing that we combine our operations," she said. "I am proposing that we combine everything," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the morning 2 days after the flood when she had stood in the kitchen, smelling the coffee he had made, and understood already that something had shifted. She thought about the northeast corner of his land in the spring sunshine. She thought about the summer and the water troughs and the arguments about trough placement and the fact that she had been right and he had said so. "My land," she said. "Yours," he said immediately. "Whatever is yours stays yours. We sign papers if you want, your land, your cattle, all of it in your name. I would not have it any other way." She looked at him. "You mean that?" "I have never said anything to you that I did not mean," he said, and it was true. She knew it was true because she had been paying attention for 8 months. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath. She realized it was the same breath he had held the first evening on the porch when he asked about calling on her. He held his breath when her answer mattered. "Good," he said. She laughed. "Just good." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his and held it with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had come to know the full weather of. "Good is not enough," he said. "Good does not come close. But I cannot find the right word for what it actually is." She turned her hand over and held his. "Neither can I," she said. "Good will do for now." They were married in November of 1882 at the Caldera Flats Church, on a clear cold day with a sky the color of pale ice and the smell of wood smoke from every chimney in town. It was a small ceremony, which was what both of them wanted, Clara and her husband on Myrtle's side. A couple of Owen's fellow cattle hands from Caldera Flats on his, Preacher Aldous presiding with a warmth that had been building since July. Myrtle wore a dress she had made herself, dark blue wool with cream buttons, because she was not interested in white for a second marriage, and she had made it with the same care and precision she brought to everything she made. Owen wore his good suit, which he had purchased in Caldera Flats for the occasion and which fit him considerably better than Cal's borrowed shirt had, and he stood at the front of the church with a stillness that was composed but not cold. When she walked in on Clara's arm and he turned and looked at her, his expression did the thing it sometimes did, where it was very many things at once, and she walked toward him thinking, "I know this man. 8 months is not long, but I know this man the way you know land when you have walked every inch of it in every kind of weather. I know the shape of him." Preacher Aldous read the words, and they said the words back, and Owen slipped a ring on her finger that he had made himself from a piece of worked silver wire twisted around a small garnet chip. He had found a silversmith in Caldera Flats who had taught him the basic technique in 3 sessions, and when the preacher said he could kiss his bride, he kissed her once properly in front of everyone, and the small congregation made the sound small congregations make, and she was aware, in the moment of it, of a fullness in her chest that she recognized as something she had not been sure she would feel again. They combined the 2 ranching operations that winter, the practical work of merging 2 households and 2 herds and 2 sets of tools and 2 years of established habits. They decided to live in Myrtle's house. It was larger, the infrastructure was more established, and the land was better situated relative to the water supply. And Owen's house on the parcel would serve as a bunkhouse and storage when needed, and eventually as housing for the hand they planned to hire when the herd grew large enough to need one. The combining was not without friction, because 2 people who have each run their own operations their own way will not always agree about how things should be done. They disagreed about the timing of the fall branding. They disagreed about whether the northwest fence needed replacing this year or could hold another season. They disagreed, memorably, about the proper way to make biscuits. The fence argument lasted 2 days and was resolved when Owen walked the fence with her and acknowledged that she was right about the corner post. The branding argument was resolved by a compromise that turned out to be better than either of their individual positions. The biscuit argument was never fully resolved, but became a running conversation about methodology that lasted years and produced some extremely good biscuits. What they did not argue about was the essential nature of the arrangement. Owen did what he said he would do. He signed papers putting Myrtle's land firmly in her name, a thing that required the intervention of a lawyer in Caldera Flats who was mildly confused by the request, but executed it professionally. He never once attempted to redirect her authority over her own land or her own decisions about it. He worked beside her and offered his thinking when asked and sometimes when not asked, and when she overruled him he said all right, and that was the end of it. She, for her part, learned things. That he worked better with structure, and she worked better with instinct, and together they were considerably better than either alone. That he slept deep and still and warm, and was excellent to sleep next to in the Oklahoma winter. That he was the kind of person who noticed things, small things, the things that needed doing before they became problems, and acted on them without announcement, so that she would discover he had fixed the rattling shutter or sharpened the kitchen knives or patched the section of coop roof she had been meaning to get to, and all without having said a word about it. That he was, in the way that mattered most, a man you could count on, which was the rarest thing she knew. The spring of 1883 was dry and productive, and by summer she was certain, with the particular bodily certainty that needed no medical confirmation, that she was pregnant. She was 32 years old, and she had not been pregnant with Cal. They had wanted children and they had not come, which had been its own quiet grief. And she stood in the kitchen on a June morning feeling this certainty and felt simultaneously frightened, and something so large and bright she did not immediately have a word for it. She waited until evening. She waited until after supper when they were on the porch, which was their habitual place, the place where they had become themselves to each other. "I have something to tell you," she said. He put down his cup. He was watching her with the full attention expression. "Tell me," he said. "I believe I am pregnant," she said. The silence lasted 3 full seconds, and then he was on his feet and she was on her feet, and he had his arms around her, not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality of a stage production, but with the careful intensity of a man embracing something he is afraid of breaking and desperately does not want to break, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. "Myrtle," he said into her hair, just her name. "I know," she said, which was everything. He took her to see the doctor in Caldera Flats the following week, not because she needed him to escort her, but because he would not have been able to stay behind. The doctor, a practical man named Whitfield who had been in the territory long enough to have seen everything, confirmed it and gave her the standard advice of the period, and told Owen twice to let her work as she was accustomed to working, because she was healthy and strong, and attempting to coddle a woman of Myrtle Quinn's constitution would end badly for everyone. Owen received this advice with good grace and mostly followed it, with occasional lapses that Myrtle addressed directly and without sympathy, and which he accepted with a combination of sheepishness and unrepentant caring that she found it impossible to be properly annoyed by. The fall of 1883 brought the harvest and the herd's best season yet. They were running 63 head now, a real operation, and the clear cold evenings when Owen would sit beside her in the kitchen while she sewed and read to her from whatever book she put in front of him, because she was finding in the later months that she wanted to be read to, which was a want she had not known she had. He read well. He did not perform it. He simply read in that low, even voice, and she would sit with her sewing and listen, and outside the wind would move across the Oklahoma plains and the oil lamp would glow, and she thought more than once, "This is the life." Not the life she had planned, not the life she had expected, not the life she had been building in the long silence after Cal died. Something better than any of those things. Something she had not had the specific imagination to plan. Their son was born in February of 1884 on a cold, clear night with stars so bright they were almost violent. Owen was there for the whole of it, which was not always the custom but which he had made clear in September was not negotiable, and he held her hand with steady pressure through the hours of it, And when the doctor who came from Caldera Flats finally said it was done and placed the baby in her arms, Owen was right beside her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him, the controlled and careful surface of him completely gone. "Look at that," he said softly. "I know," she said. The baby was red and furious about the cold and already working on a set of lungs that would serve him well. "What will we call him?" Owen asked, and she heard in his voice that he had been thinking about this for months and was very carefully not imposing. "I was thinking James," she said. "James Owen Ramsey." He looked at her. The expression was back, the one with too many things in it to name. "You want to use my name," he said. "It is his name too," she said. "He is yours." Owen touched the baby's head with the back of one finger so gently and said, "James," as if testing the weight of it. "Hello, James." James Owen Ramsey announced his opinion of this greeting at considerable volume, and the doctor said something approving, and Clara, who had come to help and was sitting in the corner, laughed. The years settled in around them the way good years do, not in dramatic events but in accumulated dailiness, the texture of a life lived well with another person. James grew with the particular vigor of a child who has good soil to grow in, sturdy and curious, and already, by 3 years old, following his parents across the property with the purposeful expression of a person who intends to understand how everything works. They hired a hand in the spring of 1885, a young man of 20 named Thomas Birch, who had come up through the territory looking for work, and who turned out to be steady and good with the cattle and grateful for the stability. Owen taught him what he needed to know with the same patience that had characterized everything else Owen did, and Thomas proved himself quickly, which allowed Owen and Myrtle to take on the additional 50 acres adjacent to their northeast boundary that came available when old Mrs. Harmon's son decided to sell. 350 acres total now, one continuous operation, the 2 original parcels and the addition, running nearly 90 head, and a diversified operation that included the kitchen garden, which had expanded over the years into something productive enough to sell surplus at the Caldera Flats market. Myrtle ran the market side of things, which she had a talent for: the negotiating, the pricing, the understanding of what the town needed and when. Owen noticed in the fall of 1885 that she had been making notes in the blank pages at the back of her household book: calculations, records of prices, records of what sold and what did not, a pattern of supply and demand that she had been tracking without articulating what she was doing with it. "You are running a business," he said, looking at the notes. "I always have been," she said. "I mean beyond the ranch," he said. "These numbers, you are thinking about expanding the market operation." She looked at him. He looked at the numbers. "I was going to bring it up," she said. "Bring it up now," he said, and sat down. She brought it up. She had been thinking, she said, about the fact that Caldera Flats did not have a proper dry goods store, only the supply depot that was run by a man who was frankly unreliable and whose pricing was exploitative, particularly for the smaller homesteaders who had less leverage. She had been thinking about whether there was a way to establish a more reliable supply and distribution system, whether through a formal store or a cooperative arrangement. She had preliminary numbers in the back of her household book. He listened to all of it. He asked questions, intelligent, specific questions. He said, "The cooperative model is more practical in the short term, less capital needed." He said, "I know Hester Claypool has been talking about something similar with the women from the church." He said, "Clara's husband has connections with the freight operation out of Guthrie. They worked on it together for the better part of the winter, and in the spring of 1886 the Caldera Flats Cooperative Supply was established, a modest enterprise organized by Myrtle Quinn Ramsey and 5 other women from the surrounding homesteads, with a board that included their husbands and met quarterly. It was not a revolutionary business. It was a practical one. It served the people it intended to serve, and it ran on honest principles, and it was exactly what the territory needed. The bank man, who came quarterly with his leather satchel and his careful expression, had a different expression now. When he came to call, he had changed from careful sympathy to careful respect, and Myrtle received both expressions with the same equanimity. In the summer of 1886, she realized she was pregnant again. She told Owen the same way she had told him the first time, on the porch in the evening, watching the ridge. He made the same sound, the breath going out of him, and put his arm around her instead of standing up this time, and she leaned into him in the warm evening. "James will be interested," he said. "James will try to supervise," she said. "He gets that from somewhere," Owen said. She elbowed him. He tightened his arm. Their daughter came in January of 1887, arriving with considerably less drama than James had, as though she had calculated the most efficient approach and implemented it. They named her Ruth Clara Ramsey, the second name for Clara Hatch, who had been present at both births, and who was the nearest thing to family Myrtle had in the territory. James, aged 3, received his sister with the thoughtful seriousness he brought to most new developments, studied her for a long moment, and announced that her hands were very small. He spent the next week stationed near her whenever he was in the house, which Myrtle had not anticipated, and which made Owen's expression go to the very many things at once version whenever he witnessed it. Ruth grew with the specific force of a person who knows exactly what she wants, which from the very beginning was apparent to everyone around her. She had Owen's eyes, that clear and steady gray, and Myrtle's jaw and her own entirely individual personality, which announced itself at approximately 6 months and never changed in its essential nature thereafter. The Oklahoma Territory was changing around them through those years, the changes that come when land that has been contested becomes formally organized, when the settlements thicken into something more structured, when the distances between neighbors shrink. The Indian Territory to the east was being reshaped by policies from Washington that Myrtle and Owen both knew were unjust and said so among themselves, and in the quarters where saying so could do any good, which were limited. The Dawes Act of 1887 and the pressure on the Cherokee and Creek and Choctaw nations was a running sorrow in the background of the decade, the kind of injustice that continues whether or not you acknowledge it, and acknowledging it without the power to stop it was its own complicated weight. Owen and Myrtle both understood, in the way of people who had arrived somewhere and built something on land that had not always been available to them, the cost of that availability. They were not unaware people. They made what they could of that awareness in the limited sphere they inhabited. In the fair dealing they extended to every person who came to their gate regardless of origin, in the cooperative that served everyone who needed it, in the quiet and consistent decency they tried to model for their children. James grew into a boy of seriousness and competence, walking the fence lines with his father at 7, understanding the water management systems by 8, already developing the instinct for problem-solving that he had inherited from both parents and refined into something that was wholly his own. He was not a boisterous child. He was a thinking child. He watched things until he understood them, and then he did them quietly and well. Ruth was the counterweight, the one who asked every question immediately without waiting to understand the answer first, who could coax a smile out of her father with a directness that was almost surgical, who had her mother's stubbornness doubled, and somehow also her mother's deep practical common sense, which was an unusual combination in a child of 4 that suggested it would be even more formidable in an adult. Owen and Myrtle had been married 5 years when she found him on the porch one evening in the fall of 1887, sitting in what had become his habitual chair, looking out at the ridge with an expression she recognized as the long-seeing kind, the kind that travels over the visible landscape to somewhere further. She sat in her chair and waited. "I was thinking about Dooley," he said, eventually, "his old foreman, the one who had died outside Abilene." "Tell me about him," she said. He had told her pieces over the years, but now he told her more, the full shape of the man, the patience, the absolute competence, The way he had taken a 20-year-old Owen Ramsey who had arrived at the cattle operation with a horse and a bedroll and no other qualifications, and had turned him into a man who could read weather and land and animal behavior with equal facility. The way he had said on one of his last good days that the best thing a man could do was find the place where his work was his own. He would have liked this place, Owen said. He would have liked you in it, Myrtle said. He looked at her. She looked back. I have been thinking, he said, about how much of what I have here I would not have if I had not ridden into your flood. You did not ride into my flood, she said. You were swept into it. All right, he said. If I had not been swept into your flood and if you had not come out into it to pull me in. She thought about that. The rain, the fence post, the rope she kept on the porch post out of habit. I have thought about that too, she said. The particular set of circumstances that had to be in exactly the right arrangement. Makes me careful with things, he said. Careful with this. He gestured, taking in the house, the land, the evening, the whole accumulated weight of the life they had made. Me too, she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. He did not say anything else. She held his hand in the cooling evening, the ridge going purple in the last light, and in the house behind them she could hear the sounds of James and Ruth engaged in whatever the current negotiation was, which would require parental intervention before long, and the smell of the stew she had left simmering came through the kitchen window, and the horses moved in the corral with the soft sound they made at dusk. This, she thought. This is what I could not have planned. This is the thing that the flood brought in. The spring of 1888 found the Ramsey operation at its strongest point yet. The 90 head had grown to 112. Thomas Birch had been promoted to foreman, and they had hired a second hand, and the cooperative was serving 42 families in the Caldera Flats area. Myrtle was 37 years old and had more energy than she had had at 30, which was the particular paradox of people who have found their right life. Owen was 39, and the gray at his temples that had started in the winter had settled into a look that suited him in the way of men whose faces grow into themselves over time. They had a conversation in the spring about the mortgage, which had been a feature of their financial landscape since before Owen arrived, and Myrtle put the household book on the table and they looked at the numbers together, which they did regularly and without drama, and she said, I think we can pay it clear this year. He looked at the numbers. He looked again. We can pay it clear this year, he said. She had been carrying that mortgage for 7 years. Cal had taken it on when they homesteaded, a 40-year note that had felt in the dark January after his death like a rope around her neck. She had made every payment through the hard years. She had kept the land. Do you want to go to the bank tomorrow? Owen asked. Yes, she said. They went to the bank the next day and paid the mortgage clear, and the bank man with his leather satchel shook both their hands, and on the way back home Myrtle sat on the wagon seat beside Owen and felt something come loose inside her chest that had been tight for 7 years, a particular quality of worry that she had been carrying for so long she had stopped noticing the weight of it. All right? Owen asked, watching her face. Better than all right, she said. He put the reins in one hand and put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder while Garrison and the second horse pulled them through the spring morning toward home. That evening she stood in the kitchen she had painted herself and looked at the herbs still drying from the ceiling beam, and the jars still labeled in her tight hand, and the coat hook by the door where Owen's coat now hung beside hers. And she thought about the woman she had been 6 years ago, standing at this same window watching a flood. She thought about what that woman had wanted and what she had been afraid to want in the great gap between those two things, and how the gap had been closed by an act of pure instinct, a rope thrown into a flood, a door opened to a stranger, a life reassembled from the water up. Owen came in behind her. She heard him stop, heard the moment of stillness that meant he was reading her mood with the accuracy that 5.5 years had given him. What are you thinking? He asked. I am thinking about the flood, she said. He came to stand beside her at the window, The evening was warm and smelled of new grass. "What about it?" he asked. "Just that it was a terrible thing," she said. "That turned into the best thing." He put his hand at the small of her back, the familiar pressure of it. "Not the flood that was the best thing," he said. "You were the best thing. The flood just delivered me to you." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her in the way he had looked at her that first night with the candle light and the borrowed coat and the coffee that was barely coffee. That attentive, unhurried, genuine way. Except now, she knew every version of that look and what it meant, and it still made something move in her chest that she had decided she would never take for granted. "That is a very good thing to say," she said. "I have had 5 years to work up to it," he said. She laughed and he smiled, and outside the window the Oklahoma evening was gentle and warm, and their children's voices came from somewhere near the barn, and the smell of supper filled the kitchen, and the land stretched away in every direction, hers and his and theirs, solid and present under a sky that had gone to gold. She kissed him, quick and certain, the way you kiss someone when you have all the time in the world and you want them to know it. "Come on," she said. "Supper." "In a minute," he said, not letting go. She stayed in the minute. The summer that followed was the kind people talked about for years afterward, warm and well-watered, the grass deep and green and the cattle fat on it. Thomas Birch married a young woman named Ellen, who had come to the territory with her family from Tennessee, and Myrtle and Owen went to the wedding in Caldera Flats and danced for the first time in their combined knowledge of each other, which turned out to be very good information. Owen danced with the same deliberate ease that characterized everything he did, and she danced with an unself-conscious joy that she had not known she had available. "You never told me you could dance," he said. "You never asked," she said. "I am asking a great many things I should have asked earlier," he said, and turned her, and the fiddle played, and the evening was warm, and Caldera Flats was full of light. James, at 4 years old, was observed by his parents to be dancing alone near the refreshment table with focused seriousness, emulating the adults, and Myrtle pressed her hand to her mouth watching him and felt the laughter and the love arrive together, which was how they usually arrived in the life she was living. Owen saw her face and looked where she was looking, and his expression did the thing. She took his hand and held it. By the fall of 1888, they had begun talking about the house. Not the house they had, which was Myrtle's original homestead house, sound and well-maintained and full of 7 years of repairs and alterations. But the house they could build now, if they wanted to, something larger, something designed for the family they had become rather than the family of one they had been. Something with a room for each child and a proper parlor, and the south-facing room off the main living area that had been in Owen's notebooks years ago. They argued about it with the pleasure that characterized their arguments, not competitive, but generative, each of them pushing the thinking further. Owen wanted to build entirely new. Myrtle wanted to expand the existing structure, which she pointed out was already on the best situated ground relative to wind and water and sun. Owen acknowledged she was right, and they designed the expansion together over a winter of evenings at the kitchen table, Owen drawing with a precise hand that had improved considerably since the notebooks he had lost to the flood, Myrtle annotating with the practical specificity of someone who had been living in the space. They broke ground in the spring of 1889, hiring a carpenter from Caldera Flats and doing a great deal of the work themselves. James was 5 and intensely involved. Ruth was 2 and also intensely involved in a different way, which primarily meant that she needed to be where the action was regardless of whether it was safe for her, a quality that required Thomas Birch's entire secondary attention for the better part of 4 months. The expansion was complete by early fall, and the new house was everything they had planned: the extra rooms, the south-facing light, the larger kitchen with the proper window that looked out over the land, the way Myrtle had always wanted a kitchen window to look. On the first night in the completed house, they sat at their old kitchen table, which they had moved to the new kitchen because it was their table and neither of them had any interest in replacing it, and ate supper with James and Ruth and the sound of the house around them, new walls and new wood and the familiar lamp. "Well," Owen said. "Well," Myrtle said. "We built a house," he said. "We have been building this house for 6 years," she said. "The carpenter just made it official." He looked at her across the table and the children and the lamplight. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, and she knew what it meant and held it without putting it into words because some things did not need words. "What do you think, James?" Owen asked. James considered the question with his habitual seriousness. He was 5 1/4 and already had the look of a person who would be measuring the world's rainfall and the growth rates of fence posts before he was 10. "My room is good," he said. "I can see the north pasture from the window." "I can see it too," said Ruth, who shared nothing with James in temperament but everything in this particular ambition, the desire to see as far as possible in every direction. "Both of you can see the north pasture," Myrtle confirmed, "and you will be in bed before it is fully dark, and I do not want to hear anything to the contrary." Both children looked at Owen, which was their standard procedure when Myrtle had delivered an unappealable verdict. Owen looked back at them with a face that was carefully neutral. "Your mother said it," he said, "so that is what is happening." James accepted this. Ruth argued for 4 more minutes and then also accepted it, which was Ruth's process, to argue the 4 minutes and then accept the logic when it was fully presented, which they had both learned to wait for. Myrtle put the children to bed in their new rooms and came back to the kitchen and stood with her hands on the back of her chair and looked at Owen, who was reading in the lamplight, and she thought about a February night 6 years ago when the water was rising, and she had seen a man clinging to a fence post in the flood and had not, for even 1 second, considered leaving him there. She thought about what would have been if she had not gone out into the flood. He would have found some other handhold, probably. Made it to higher ground. Gone on to Caldera Flats eventually and bought his land and become her neighbor, and perhaps their paths would have crossed anyway in the small world of the territory. Perhaps something would have developed from simple proximity. Or perhaps not. She was not a superstitious woman, and she did not believe in fate as a fixed thing, predetermined and inevitable. But she believed in the accumulation of small decisions, the way a single choice to reach toward something rather than away from it could alter the whole direction of a life. The rope thrown into the flood, the door opened to a stranger, the supper set for 2 instead of 1. The words said honestly when it would have been easier to say nothing. Owen looked up from his book and found her watching him. "Come sit down," he said. She came and sat down. He put his book aside and looked at her across the table with the full attention that had not dimmed in 6 years and which she knew, with the certainty of everything she had learned about this man, would not dim in the next 60. "Happy?" he asked. She thought about the question with the care it deserved. "Yes," she said, "completely." He reached across the table and took her hand, and outside the new windows the Oklahoma night was clear and full of stars, and the land lay quiet under them. And in the 2 new rooms down the hall, their children slept in the deep and untroubled way of children who are safe. And the house that had once held only silence held everything now, full to the rafters with the living weight of a life they had built together out of a flood, and a rope, and a room offered to a stranger. That was how it was. That was how it stayed. In the years that came after, when people in Caldera Flats asked Myrtle Ramsey how she had met her husband, and people did ask, because there was something about the 2 of them that made people want to know the story, she would tell them about the flood of 1882, the 3 weeks of rain, the rising creek, the man clinging to her fence post in chest-deep water, and they would ask, as people always did, "Were you not afraid to let a stranger into your home?" And she would look at them with those level eyes that had looked at a great many things in her life without flinching, and she would say, "I was more afraid of what the flood would take if I did not." Owen, if he happened to be nearby when she told the story, which he often was, would listen to it with the expression she knew best and loved most, the one with too many things in it to name, And when she got to that part, he would look at her in the way that said everything the words did not, and she would look back, and between them would pass the entire accumulated weight of a life that had been, against every odd and in spite of every loss, exactly what it ought to be. The water had risen and the water had fallen, the way it always does, the way it will continue to do long after everyone is gone. But what it left behind, in the red clay mud of an Oklahoma morning, was something that no subsequent flood could reach. It was the kind of thing that holds,